This is a video of the making of a Star Wars Inspired Droid. As with many of my builds, it started with a sketch, more of a doodle than a drawing, two truncated cones mounted on a cylinder with some LEDs and an antenna. The smaller circle was cut with a hole saw, but the larger one was too big and so needed cut with a jigsaw. I don't have a circle jig for the jigsaw, so traced out the circle and freehanded it, then sanded and rasped out the worst of the wobbles. I then made 4 legs to support the top. I should have gone with 3, as getting 4 to all match up perfectly is a pain, where 3 will always sit flush. Before mounting these, I wanted to cut out the middle, as I wasn't sure the mounting legs would take the force of the hole saw if I cut the middle out after mounting the legs. But once the middle was cut out, I needed to carefully wedge it back in place in order to use a dowel to find the centre for the top piece to ensure it was mounted centrally to the bottom piece. The top piece was glued in place, centred, and a little rasping and sanding was done to give an angled edge in which to mount the sides. For the big lens, I thought that a magnifying eyepiece would be ideal, but when I mocked up where I would mount it, I realised that if mounted on a vertical piece, that piece would interfere too much with the edge. I tried cutting a mounting piece at 45 degrees, but it didn't mount through as far as I needed. The magnifying eyepiece was beautiful, it had been exactly what I had wanted, but it was just too big. So with regret, I went with a tube with an internal diameter of 10mm that would take a 10mm LED. Meanwhile, I'd created a middle piece which consisted of a slightly smaller circle and a bottom that was made in a similar manner to the top, except the top and bottom were mounted with circles of wood with the centre cut out to hold and stabilise the plastic pipe that it would be mounted on. I skinned the top and bottom with lollipop sticks which were cut at an angle to produce 2 triangular pieces and then glued with the 2 wider ends at the bottom and the thinner ones at the top. These were trimmed to length as I went, as once the whole thing was done I wouldn't be able to use the flat top as a guide for the saw. 3 pieces were made slightly wider and pre-drilled for 3mm LEDs, as I was worried about tear out or even breaking the lollipop if I drilled them without any back support. Then came time to skin around the 10mm LED tube. I realised that a complex curve with a tube sticking through it that wasn't perpendicular to either of the curves was going to be very complicated to skin flush to the tube. Why oh why had I decided to offset the pipe slightly to the side. A few small pieces of wood were made to sit slightly smaller than the final dimensions and glued in place. Then it was time to fill and sand, fill and sand, fill and sand. As is so often the case, I get fed up with this process and convince myself that I'm just sanding off the last layer of filler and become impatient to move on, but when the paint is applied I look back and wish I'd done another pass. The antenna is made from a wire coat hanger bent with pliers, the jaws of which were wrapped in electrical tape to avoid marking the wire. The little kink towards the top proved harder than I'd expected to get right. The little ball on top was cut from a piece of pine and rasped and sanded into shape. This worked surprisingly well, but when I tried to drill a hole for the coat hanger I managed to split it. I've done this before fitting coat hanger, as it's about 1.9mm and my 2mm drill bits are actually 1.8mm. For a piece of wood this small, the difference is enough to split the wood when the wire is forced into the hole. Fortunately, it glued back together without issue, and I carefully filed and sanded the top of the wire down to a slightly smaller diameter, and it fitted without issue. The electronics was soldered on Veriboard. I'm using an Atmel Tiny 85 as an 8-pin microcontroller to drive the 4 LEDs and to read a digital signal from a light-dependent resistor to switch from bright day mode to a dimmer night mode. Then the outside was painted white except for the tip of the antenna and the central band, which were painted red. The electronics was mounted in the top section. I realised that I should have left a flat piece to mount the main board to, so I had to make 2 small triangles to reattach to the angled pieces in the top half of the droid to screw the board to. It was finally finished and I could apply power. My camera saturates quite badly on the bright LEDs. The main 10mm LED is slightly off red rather than the white with a hint of pink that the camera shows it as. I'm not sure about the all-white body. It might need some detailing or weathering, but for now it's finished.